These are not my favorite books, nor the ones that changed my mind more than others. These are the 17 that most of all I've carried. What does it mean to carry a book? I've spent 2 years pondering this question, and I'm still unsure. Nor am I certain if I have carried these or they have in fact carried me. It's not a question of lifting, transporting, or supporting a bound volume from one place to another. We do that all the time without it being special. Not a single book I was required to carry in college is mentioned here. No, the sort of carrying to which these interrelated essays refer is more the transitive verb kind, the way that one adopts something or resolves to do something. For instance, the way a committee or court might carry a motion. There is also the intransitive sort of carrying, which applies to some books in my life as well. I am transmitted the way that the sound of church bells ringing in a city might carry for miles. With bells, this makes good sense, but this wouldn't and couldn't happen with books without some sort of magic, kismet, or enchantment, and with just the right coalescence of person and situation, the ideal moment. These chapters are all about those moments when both the time and the book being carried have been sacred. I realize not everyone feels it necessary to identify bookish influence in their lives, and I know that there are fewer of us than ever who do. Less than half of adults read just one book in a given year, so if you're still reading, know that you are among a precious few. Technological developments have caused bookish people even to reduce our habit. It has begun to happen to me. We're enthralled to another medium, which is a century old but now portable in our pockets and available whenever we demand it. In the 30 minutes I have at the end of each day to be quiet, when I used to read one of several books I was in the thick of, I now often turn to video on a screen. 500 years ago, when movable type was invented, people were captivated by printed books in ways that terrified the upholders of every older way of transmitting knowledge and wisdom. Oral storytelling most of all, or the church, according to the priest in Victor Hugo's Notre Dame of Paris. It is while this latest cultural shift is underway, and my attention to books is already not what it once was, that feels like the right time to record what books have meant to me, what they have done for me. I may even look back on this as an exercise of recording what was meaningful, realizing that I may not be able to fully understand it in the future. I write like a man short on time, with the beginning signs of memory loss. I write for everyone who still looks to bookshelves and cracks open volumes with the expectation that this next one just might change my life. I am that foolish still. Will never lose that optimism for what a book can do. It works best in my experience when the book is old and worn. The English essayist and critic William Hazlitt wrote 2 centuries ago, "I hate to read new books. There are 20 or 30 volumes that I have read over and over again, and these are the only ones that I have any desire to ever read at all." If it weren't for the fact that I've made my living editing, publishing, marketing, and writing books that are new, I'd say that I agree. I also know that those of us still influenced by books and authors are usually less prone to influences than those who lean on the words of entertainers, gurus, and celebrities. Book people tend to choose fewer gods, and then discerningly and discriminately. Mine sit quietly on shelves, which is why when I see a book's descriptive blurb include a marketer's declaration that it's compulsively readable, I put it back on the display where I found it. No thank you. Not interested in exaggeration when it comes to books. If you find anything compulsively readable, you should see a therapist. Even so, the English writer R.H. Benson wrote more than a century ago to a novelist he had never met to tell him that one of his novels was "among the 3 books from which I never wish to be separated." This I understand. This memoir is my collection of 17. I was, in fact, schooled in the euphemistic and exaggerated art of copywriting for book jackets. Highly sought after, widely regarded, and recognized as an expert in were phrases we used when an author was, in fact, green as a willow. And, endorsed by leaders in his field, we employed also when reaching for straws to explain that if needed, a few of the author's friends might testify on their behalf. There is only one instance of compulsively readable I know to have been true, and I believe it because one of my professors was the teacher's assistant of David F. Swenson at the University of Minnesota, who told him about it, and from Swenson to my professor's ear to my own seems a trustworthy chain. The book was Soren Kierkegaard's concluding unscientific postscript, an unlikely tome for many of us to stay up all night reading, but Swenson did so, unable to put it down. He found it by chance on the shelves of the Minneapolis Public Library in 1901 in Danish. It seemed to have a philosophical content, he said, since a hasty turning of its leaves showed me that its pages were liberally sprinkled with abstruse philosophical terms. How fabulous it is that one could have found a thick philosophical work in a Scandinavian language in the public library stacks in Minneapolis in the early years of the 20th century. The name of the author told me nothing, Swenson explained. He'd never heard of Kierkegaard. No one in North America had then, except perhaps the librarian who imported that rare book from Copenhagen to meet the needs of philosophically inclined Danes recently immigrated to the Twin Cities. This was decades before Kierkegaardia ever saw English. Swenson was so moved that he did not sleep. On a venture, I took the book home. It was Saturday evening, and I did not rise from the reading begun on reaching home until 2:30 Sunday morning. By Sunday night I had finished the more than 500 closely printed pages of the book. So impossible was it for me to lay it aside until I had finished it. Then he devoted the rest of his life to understanding the Danish writer, earning a Ph.D. in philosophy, and teaching it at the University of Minnesota, as well as translating Kierkegaard into English. The professor of mine who was Swenson's assistant was Paul L. Homer. I became what some might call a disciple of his for 3 years toward the end of his life. Retired from Yale, where he taught in both the university philosophy department and the divinity school, Homer returned to his Swedish pietist roots for a month each year to teach the December term at our little North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago. I was in my early 20s, fresh out of college, and Homer's Socratic style and religious piety appealed strongly to me. After taking his seminars on Wittgenstein, Kierkegaard, he wove them together, and C.S. Lewis, I promptly informed my supervisor I wanted to switch from the MDiv to the MA program and write my thesis on Homer. So perhaps he is the reason why no one ever had to endure me as their pastor. In 1990 and 1991, I published 2 essays about Homer in a tiny journal out of Minnesota called Pietisten, printed on thick 11-inch by 17-inch textured paper, which was folded once and then stapled along the fold to create a publication that looked like a menu in a good restaurant. One article was titled Something About Homer, in homage to him as well as to his old professor and friend Swenson, who published one of the first books in English about Kierkegaard, calling it Something About Kierkegaard, in 1941. Today, that essay and the other read as more hero worship than scholarship, but I'm still proud of them. Before leaving seminary to work in books, I saw the look of gratitude in Homer's eyes one day at lunch when he encouraged me to enter a Ph.D. program and teach in a university. "It's a wonderful way to spend a life," he wistfully said over his soup. But that wasn't the path for me. I tell that story about Swenson's compulsive reading in part because Kierkegaard wrote in his journal 3 years after his concluding unscientific postscript first appeared that only about 50 copies had sold. 50. It had gone nowhere, fell flat, made no impression whatsoever. Yet a copy somehow made its way to Minneapolis, where Swenson found it on a shelf and then stayed up all night reading it. That's magic, kismet, serendipity, and coalescence. I have similar stories, and I imagine you do too. Books have an uncanny presence in our lives that goes unnoticed. Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote to a friend, "It happens to us once or twice in a lifetime to be drunk with some book which probably has some extraordinary relative power to intoxicate us and none other." I would only change the word intoxicate to something more like carry. And I have been blessed with this more than once or twice. I'd say 17 times so far. Have you carried a book in your bag long after the time of reading it has passed, because it has become essential for you in ways that would be difficult to explain? Have you been caught holding a book close to your face to better examine its paper or type, or even to take in its smell? I recall the American interfaith teacher Lex Hickson commenting how in the 1960s his copy of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna smelled sweetly of fragrance, only to discover a decade later that all of the copies of it were stored before being sold in the incense room at the Ramakrishna Vivekananda Center on 94th Street in New York City. Several books in my life have held a metaphorical fragrance, and without the rational explanation. So these are the books I have carried. I write for those who know that the hold books can have upon us can be difficult to explain, and the books we carry often say more about us than our clothes, our homes, even our spouses and children. I begin with a story from midlife, only because it was in midlife when I first began to realize the magic of books. Each chapter then builds onto the next as I tell of books I've carried at pivotal moments and those that have carried me from one place to another. You will experience a book that makes sense of a divorce and points the way to a new partner, a book opening up a subcontinent and a gift for wonder, and how a book given to a young reader is able to carry him across a country to a bigger world. You will glimpse how a book stands in like a wise elder when that is what is most of all needed, and a book that carried me like a raft across a rushing stream. These stories are intimate, revealing, and confessional. Through them, I hope you will see more clearly your own stories of a life with books, your own particular portable magic, to use Stephen King's knowing phrase, of how a volume can spark an understanding that comes before knowledge. While this memoir is personal, the essays are, I hope, universal in application for all readers and lovers of books. They show how the books we carry are more important than the food we eat.